Welcome back to Joy of the Hang. It's Sharon and Lauren again. Hey, Lauren.
Hey, Sharon. Happy APW.
And what is APW, please?
Well, please, it's Ask Play Wednesday. It's like hump day, but a lot more fun.
Ask Play. Well, that depends on who you ask.
I guess so.
All right, everybody. APW. Put that in your dictionary.
File it away.
Ask Play Wednesday. Here we are. And we are here welcoming a new guest this week, Ashley Jones. Welcome, Ashley.
Hi, Ashley.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you for being here. And I saw on maybe your Instagram page that you are the ambassador of love.
Oh, yes. Yes. And a friend of grief.
Oh, I love that. And Ashley is also an author of a soon-to-be published book called When You Can't See the Light, a trauma-informed guide to surviving a significant loss. Sadly, Ashley lost her daughter, Skylar, at 21 months old, and I can't imagine anything more tragic. So she'll be talking to us about that today and how she healed and is now helping others heal through her nonprofit organization called Momento Foundation. She's the founder and CEO, and she's also an amazing photographer who specializes in photographing people that have terminal illness, right? And creating a memento for their loved ones. She's also been a TEDx speaker, featured on BBC and other media outlets, and she's from Chattanooga, Tennessee. The Momento Foundation is headquartered in Atlanta, and you can find out more about it at momentofoundation.org. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you so much.
All right.
And I want to interject a little first as well and say that, with all of the things you just mentioned, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you about all of them. And we brought up, the grief and you losing Skylar, what have you. But I want to tell all of our listeners, Sharon and I have mentioned before that you might witness someone in a moment, you might hear them talking on a podcast or on the radio, and you don't really know what someone's going through in their life or what they've been through in the past, what have you. So I just recently met you, and I met you by just randomly walking up and talking to you.
Yes.
As you were seated by the pool because
we both were worried that this boat was going to crash into the dock.
I think so. Yeah.
No,
it did not, but it was a multi-million dollar boat that looked like it was coming in way too fast. And so that was sort of my way in. As I saw Ashley sitting by herself, I sort of walked over and said, I think that boat seems to be docking very fast. And then you agreed.
I was like, it's coming in hot. I don't know how this is going to go.
Yeah, it was totally coming in hot. But we started talking about everything.
Yeah.
Two people, you 40, me 53, not knowing anything about one another, and just sort of dove into a conversation about, I think, everything and a lot of different topics before we landed on the fact that, about the charity that you run or the book that you've written or the grief you've undergone with Skylar.
Yeah, I think we started with lacrosse.
We did start with lacrosse.
And then it kind of moved into a lot of different things. And then, it's fun because we realized we had common friends it's been, it was a really cool connection.
And just crazy. And I just find your story so remarkable, and that I sat there with you for I think we talked for 45 minutes, and you were, bubbly and smiley and happy and just as you are now. But so I, felt that it was so powerful, your story of what you've been through in losing a child, and the person that you are and who you present to the world after suffering losing a child.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm curious. I think I read that she was about a month old when you found out she had a terminal illness, correct?
Yeah, there was a month old when I noticed something was wrong.
Okay.
And then we didn't get the official diagnosis till 2 months old. Okay. But then they were like, you'll be lucky to see her first birthday.
So I think a lot of people can relate to your story. Can you take us back to that time and tell us what you were feeling and how you and your husband navigated such a difficult time in your life?
Yeah, so I'll start with, we were surprised with the pregnancy because it was one of those Valentine's Day weekend, got a little lazy. And then it was like, oh, St. Patty's Day, I'm not going to be drinking. And so, I wanted to do it naturally and just like embrace the experience and the power of the woman, body. And so, I had a doula. It was an amazing experience. I loved being pregnant. I luckily didn't have severe morning sickness. And so it was really just a joyful time for me. And it was scary, right? It was a surprise. I was young. I was 24 when I got pregnant. And so it was a little terrifying. I was the first of all my friends to go through pregnancy and having a baby. And so...
Yeah, it is a lot easier when you mentioned that. I had mine, my older sister had already had hers, my husband had friends. And so you're comforted by people who tell you these things.
Right.
You're like,
no one told me about the diapers.
I'm not gonna kill this
my
child,
diapers, not her diapers. But like at the hospital, I was like, wait, I bleed for how long? Like what? So yeah, there was a lot that I had to learn and was surprised by and all that thing, but the cool thing was, it was such a miraculous experience and I was able to do it naturally and feel it all and like be present for it all. And then,
so you did not go the epidural?
I did not, And
what would you say that pain was on a...
Oh, it was so intense.
1 to 10.
But it was 10 for sure.
Okay.
'Cause when they were like, okay, time to push. And I like bared down to start to push. I was like, oh my God. And then they were like, and now it's really too late to get the epidural. So you can't change your mind. And I was like, oh dear God. I was like, the ring of fire is real. Like in case anyone wondered, like it is real.
How long?
Well, so the cool part was like, I mean, time, what was time, right? When you're in labor.
It's surreal. It's like it's happening to someone else.
Yeah. Right. And so when she, as soon as she slipped out, like as soon as her head made it through, the pain was completely gone because she was the pain. Right. And so I was like, her coming out was pain, but I was like, oh my gosh. And then I felt fine. And I was like, where's my Chick-fil-A?
Yeah.
And I'm starving and like, I'm tired, but I'm also like feeling great now because all of that there's like so much pressure relief, the pain relief. It was like,
So not to get off track, but my first child was also a natural childbirth. I didn't have an epidural either. You've had 3 kids all with
I had 3 kids all with massive amounts of epidural, so much so that when they wheeled me into the room and would ask me to get on the bed, I would always say, I can't move my legs because they
and that terrified me. And I was like, I want to be in control of my own body. Right. And so I think I can handle the pain if that means I can get up and walk afterwards.
I know. I was up walking, taking a shower, putting my makeup on.
I did maintain some control. I did not poop. Thank you very much. All 3 times I did not poop. Very proud of that.
That's awesome.
I can't remember them. I can't remember.
I'm pretty sure I did. And then I also tore a little bit. So they're so used to women having epidurals that they just started stitching me up. Oh. And I was like, I can feel every bit of that needle going in to stitch me up. I was like, I screamed. I was like, that was probably more painful than the birth. And so she's like, oh, sorry, let me give you some lidocaine. And I was like, oh my God, thanks. So it was intense, but, they sent us got her, she latched fine, like breastfeeding was great. And, went home and they're like happy, family, right?
How'd you get the name Skylar?
So my husband and I struggled so hard on names. Like I
love this. This is why I asked.
He wanted, I'm like, Kyle will probably listen to this and be like, why are you going to rag on me?
But, Kyle, what kind of names were you picking?
Topanga,
Kyle.
Boy meets girl, right? No, I was like, we cannot. I was like, and you named a bike Topanga. So like, that's not happening.
We're not naming our child.
Tallulah.
It sounds like he lost the vote 1-1.
Tallulah was another one. And I was like, you can't. That's like a dog's name. Like, I mean, I like the name Tallulah, but it just wasn't for her, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So I had names like Addison Grace.
Oh, I love Addison.
That's pretty.
Right? And I was going to call her Addie. And he was like, that's such a suburb name, like, whatever. He's like, I
Were
don't
you
think
living in the city at the time?
we were in West Midtown, Atlanta.
Okay.
And he's like, that sounds like a suburb name, and I'm like, I get it, but also it's still pretty, So we just had two very different opinions on names. And then he would say names like, he'd be like, what about Brittany? And I'd be like, ew, no, I had such a, I don't know if you cuss on this podcast, but I was like, every Brittany I knew in middle school and high school were like bitches, right? So I was like, I can't choose Brittany because it's just negative connotation, right?
Association with the name, like
yes,
you or your partner have a bad boss with the name. Yeah,
yes,
you're never liking her name.
So we waited to find out if she was a boy or a girl. So because I was like, I love surprises, love them. When can you surprise yourself?
Yeah, you
right?
Can. I agree.
So I was like, this will be fun because I don't know what's coming out of me. So like, cool, this, So we had to have a boy and a girl name, but the boy name was easy because his whole side of the family, the men's side, had passed down names through the generations. So Kyle's dad is like Stephen Ernest Jones. Kyle is Kyle Ernest Jones.
Okay.
His brother is Matthew Stephen Jones. So it was just like rotating the men's first names into the middle names and like down the generations.
Okay.
So if we had a boy, and this was back before this name became popular, because now it's like everywhere, and we were like, wow, we're trendsetters, but not really. We were going to name a boy Jackson Clayton Jones.
Oh, I like Jackson.
Yeah, and Clayton is Kyle's grandpa's name.
Okay.
And so he's Clayton Ernest Jones. And Kyle's like, please don't do Ernest. Like, our generation had like so many bad connotations, like Ernest scared stupid and, all that kind of stuff. So all I had to say, the names was crazy. We landed on Skylar because when she was born and it was like, it's a girl, we both looked at each other like, dang, we had a boy's name, we still hadn't picked out a girl's name. So yeah, so we sat and like looked at her and we're like, what's her name? And he had picked, so both of our moms' names, birth moms, are middle names Marie.
Okay.
So we were like, well, that's easy. Her middle name will be Marie because then we can honor both moms with that.
Yep.
And but when he said Skylar Marie, I was like, that song, like Skinnamarink Dinky Dink?
Yes.
Like, I was like, I feel like Skylar Marie, right?
What
like,
is that from? I do know that.
Like Sharon, Lois, and Bram.
Okay.
It's like an old, kids show from the 80s.
Okay.
So I was like, I don't know. She could get made fun of for that. I don't know. And Kyle's like, that song's, no one's going to know that song in her generation. And I was like, all right. So finally, we just needed a name to put down on the birth certificate. And I was like, Skylar works. And no one's going to really call her Skylar Marie except for us probably. And yeah, I loved it. And we didn't really look up the meaning of the name or anything, but there's a lot kind of that fits with our situation and how it played out. So, but they sent us home from the hospital, healthy baby girl, go home, love her, enjoy your family. But it was November 19th when she was born.
Okay.
And so it was really cold. I mean, it's Atlanta, so like Northerners will be like, it's really cold, sure.
Yeah.
But for me, I was like, I'm cold. And babies are used to 98 degrees in the womb, right? So I was like wrapping her in blankets all the time and just really taking her out to change her. So, but when I would take her out to change her around a month old, I noticed her right arm would come up like a chicken wing. Huh. And when I would pull it down, it would just gradually come back up as if she wasn't in control.
That's so random.
And I had worked with severely handicapped kids when I was in high school. So I went to the local elementary school and worked with teachers to support them in their classrooms with severely handicapped kids. And there was a little girl, Kimmy, who I just adored, and she had cerebral palsy. And she had these like really stiff contractures. And Skylar's chicken wing looked kind of like one of those really stiff contractures, but Skylar's wasn't stiff. Like I could bend it and move it. Right. So I was like,
what were you kind of thinking?
Yeah, I was like, well, and I was looking at her eyes and Skylar was like super tracking me and like really bright mentally. You could tell it was like, whoa, this kid's
and
on
you can have a full, great life with cerebral palsy.
Depending on the severity. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, when I was looking at her eyes, I was like, well, she's tracking. Like, I don't think it's cerebral palsy. So I bring it up at our 1 month checkup. And he was like, yeah, that's weird. Like, did she get caught when she came out? Because it could be a brachial plexus shoulder injury. And I was like, no, as soon as her head came out, I felt everything. Like she just slipped right out. Right. So I knew it wasn't the shoulder injury. And so he was like, well, I'm going to send you to a brachial plexus specialist just in case. And maybe he can direct you to the right specialist. And I was like, okay. So that specialist asked a lot about genetics and stuff like that. And I was like, man, he knows something that he's not telling me.
He went right to the genetics.
He was like, do you have any other kids? Do you have any siblings? And I'm like, no, I'm an only child. Kyle has a younger brother, but we're the first to have kids. And he's like, well, did anyone else in your family have anything wrong with them? And we were like, no, but like, also, what are you asking? Like, just ask me the question, right? Yeah. Because I'm like, you're beating around all this stuff. So when I left, and it was a snow day in Atlanta, the day that we had this appointment, it was in February. And I mentioned that because everything in Atlanta shuts down when there's like even a risk of snow, right? Like 1 inch is detrimental
like
to
Washington,
everything, right?
right?
So in the hospital building, it was like such a dramatic effect because I was like, my family's from the Midwest. I'm going to drive to this place. Like I'll be fine. And there wasn't enough ice. It was truly just snow at that point. And so I go to the appointment, and when we were leaving, I bring this up because all the lights in the office building were off. Like it was just the emergency backup lights. Huh. So it was like a very, very dramatic like hallway. Like when I looked back over my shoulder at the doctor, he had walked out into the hallway to watch me leave with my daughter. And I'm carrying her car seat out, walking down the hall. And where he stepped out in the hallway, there was like just that little can light above him that was on.
That just illuminated.
That just illuminated him. The hallway was dark, and I could just like feel pity like oozing down the hallway at me.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, damn.
But still at this point, you didn't.
No, I was like, what is he not telling me? Right. I wanted to scream at him down the hallway. Like, just tell me, right? Like, what is happening?
So did he run lab work at that point?
No. He called my pediatrician right after the appointment and said it could be one of 5 things, and they're all horrible. And so my pediatrician calls me. At this point, I'm at Home Depot picking up something for my husband. And my pediatrician calls, I answer, and he goes, Ashley, it's not good. And I was like, what do you mean? And at this point, I had a flip phone, right? So this was like way before smartphones. And he goes, if you make the really bad decision to go home and Google these, here's my personal cell phone number. You can call me anytime. Wow. And I was like, dude, if a pediatrician says that to a first-time mom, you know it's bad.
Right.
And so I call Kyle, hysterical crying, and like meanwhile all the Home Depot orange aprons are like running away from me. like we don't know why this woman's breaking down in the middle of our hallway. And Kyle's like, come home, we'll talk about it. We Googled every, the 5 options.
You never can help yourself.
Oh, right.
Everybody.
Well, and you just want to know, right? It's like just
have the information.
Yeah. And she had every symptom for SMA, and it was spinal muscular atrophy. So it's really similar to Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS, where muscles degenerate and there's no cure. And so that's how we found out. And then genetic testing confirmed it. So Kyle and I are both carriers, unknowing. 1 in 40 people are carriers, and both people have to be a carrier in order to have a kid with SMA.
I mean, what are the chances?
Right. And so that was the other thing is, so we have this daughter who's now dying, and now they're also telling us it's genetic. And so,
did they give you at that point a life expectancy?
Yeah, they said that she would likely not see her first birthday. And then when we found that out, and then it was genetic, they were like, yeah, and every child you have after this has like likely a 25% chance or higher to have SMA again. And so you're like, all right, and now we're done having kids, right? Like, so in one instance, it was like, we're losing our child and we're losing our entire future of a family, at least biologically, right?
Right.
So it was like such a huge hit, and I was not prepared for that grief, right? Because
how can anyone be prepared for that?
Well, and you're 25 years old at this point.
That's right.
You're young too. I
mean,
not that I had a similar experience with my daughter, and I won't get into it on this podcast because I want it to be about you. But I totally understand. You get hit with that news. And first of all, my first reaction is, you're wrong. you're in denial, right?
Yeah.
The first stage for me was denial. Like, there's nothing wrong with my child. They're going to beat the odds.
Yeah.
All those things, right? Mm-hmm. And then
I'm so glad you said that in the stage language that you did, because Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's really well known for the 5 stages of grief, her research was actually the 5 stages of dying. It was never meant to be applied to grief, like overall,
right,
very generally. She studied people facing their own death when she came up with the 5 stages of grief. And it was the 5 stages of death and dying. And so what's so cool about that, when you said the stage, I resonated so deeply with the 5 stages that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with in facing Skylar's diagnosis, because it was the 5 stages of death and dying, even as a parent, not us directly facing that ourselves, but like with our children, right?
Right.
And so it was so interesting because I felt the stages of that denial and anger and bargaining and being like, God, I'll do anything, right? Just like save her, right?
I remember being in, you probably did the same thing. I remember being in the chapel in the hospital room and screaming to God.
Yeah.
Like, you cannot take her.
Right.
Just having that no, this whole and knowing there's nothing you could do, that you had to put your trust in the physicians and your trust in.
Yeah.
So my outcome was different than yours, but I felt all of those things. I'm sure that that you felt.
Did you ever ask? There are certain types of genetic testing they do ahead of time.
So I did a lot of it.
You did. You think there'd be
you wouldn't
a lot that they haven't.
That.
I know, but you'd think there'd be a lot more they could do that they don't. Maybe it's
they
expensive.
now have testing for SMA in utero now, but back in the day there were no treatments for it. So even if you did find out, it was like, well, what's the point? Because we're fucked, right? It's like there's nothing we can do. So what's the point of knowing and ruining what if I would have known while I was pregnant, it would have ruined my pregnancy. I would have been so grieved. Right. And so I would have been like, I don't want to push this baby out. You're going to have to cut this baby out of me because I know the second she leaves my uterus, she's just going to get weaker and weaker. Right. So I'm pretty confident I would have had a C-section had I known, because I would not have pushed her out. And so
that's powerful.
Yeah.
That's really powerful.
And so, now there are treatments for SMA. There's still no cure, but there are treatments that can prolong the deterioration of the muscles. They can, maintain strength. And there's more and more being developed, every day, especially with AI and gene therapy and stuff like that. But, at the time I was like, I wouldn't want to know. Now they do the testing, but again, it's like, it varies from hospital to hospital system. It's kind of like luck of the draw, but.
So now you're raising this child that has a limited lifespan.
Yes.
And you don't know how many days you're given.
Mm-hmm.
And you just one day at a time?
Yeah. I probably didn't eat for a week, and I was breastfeeding. So I think I was just doing protein smoothies because I was just like, I can't, I'm so sick over this. Right.
Of course. Yeah.
And so, it was like, okay, we had our cry and pity party and be like, why us? And then we quickly got to, well, why not us, right? Because we're no better than anyone else. And life is hard for a lot of people. And this is just our hand that we've been dealt, And so we can't really swap out our cards, right?
Yeah.
And so now we got to play them and make the most of it. And so how do we really sit with our daughter while we have her, to enjoy her, to make memories, to treasure the time that we have, and we can be depressed and feel sorry for ourselves after she's gone, right?
But that's just so amazing that you had the ability to do that as a 24-year-old. Mm-hmm. Most of us, I'm in my 50s and I still struggle with, rationally dealing with something that, is bad or not going your way, and certainly not on a level like that at all. But it's just remarkable that at 24 years old, you were able to be self-aware of how life is unfair, and instead of dwelling in self-pity.
Yeah, I think Kyle and I both have always been told, like, oh, you're wise beyond your years, you know, or you're an old soul or whatever.
But can you attribute that to anything? I mean, it's such a valuable lesson in life. And I'm sure anyone, you know, anyone and everyone listening, you know, has a story and would love to know maybe what you were able to, you know, do a deep dive into yourself, how you were able to do that.
Honestly, I think it was the trying to be mindful of my feelings and my emotions. I've always been a deep thinker and a deep feeler, like always like writing in my journals, like through high school. Again, I'm the only child. So like I didn't have like a sibling to talk to or process with. So I'm very much like a deep thinker, writer, artist, creative person. I think part of it is I'm also a practical person in the sense of looking at the situation and saying, what are my options? Right? What are my options? And is there anything I'm not thinking of? And if not, then like looking at what was before us, it was like, we can roll over and feel sorry for ourselves and have a pity party. But in doing so, we're going to waste some of this time that we have with our daughter, which is going to suck if we're just like miserable and depressed and not waking up each day like with joy in our hearts for her.
Right.
We can, you know, give her everything we have and try and make her life the best as possible, no matter how short it is, which sounds like a pretty good option. You know, there were other options that weren't even, you know, a consideration for us. Like, you know, plenty of people will surrender their children to the hospital when they're like really technically medically intensive. So there was a child in the ICU that when we had to go into the ICU with Skylar for a couple times, there was a little kid there who had been surrendered by her parents because they just couldn't afford to take care of her and didn't want to do it. So there were other options on the table that were, you know, just not even a possibility for us. But when we really said, what are our options? It's like, how do we want to show up and how do we want to live our life? Like we get that choice. We don't get to choose what was handed to us, right? Like we don't get to choose that our daughter's dying, but we get to choose how we respond to it and how we show up each day. And I don't want to waste it. And I don't want to get to the end of my life and have regrets.
Well, and I know that you have written a book. And what is the name of that book?
It's called When You Can't See the Light.
When You Can't See the Light. And are you, you know, in that book, can you talk a little bit about the path you uncover in that book in terms of dealing with the grief? And because I think that it's remarkable in what you're saying that to me, it seems like this could be so powerful for all avenues of life, even if you haven't lost a child. And certainly I am in no way comparing, you know, minuscule things that happen in your life, because most of us would agree that the most horrific thing that can happen is losing a child, but it can be such a useful tool and so powerful for just helping people daily get through life.
Yeah. And one thing I encourage people is like not to compare grief at all, right? So like, you know, back when the pandemic hit, I wrote a blog called No Loss is Too Small to Grieve, right? Because when you lose a job or when you
go through divorce.
Go through divorce, when you have a breakup, even a boyfriend-girlfriend breakup, right? When you lose a pet.
Girlfriend breakup when your friend stops talking to you.
Yes, absolutely. Friendship endings. Like I got ghosted by a longtime friend and I was like, what the hell, right? Like that was such a hard thing for me. It was like, wow. Losing a pet, you know? There's a lot of grief that doesn't get acknowledged, but yet it's grief and we need to acknowledge it in ourselves, even if no one else does, right? And so there is no loss too small to grieve. And
I love that statement. There is no loss too small to grieve.
Yeah.
And that's coming from someone, it's even more powerful because that statement is coming from you, Ashley, who lost a 21-month-old daughter.
yeah. And I've lost aunts and grandmas and dogs that have been like sisters to me, right? I have lost best friends, other friends in car accidents. You know, it's like, and we all go through so many losses,
so the
right?
book is helpful in...
It's a practical guide because one of the most frustrating things that I found in my grief, especially with Skylar, was people would be like, oh, well, you know, people might say this to you, or you might feel this way, or this might happen to you, but no one would tell me then what, right? So I'm like, yes, this person said this shitty thing to me. Yes, there are people running the other direction when they see me in public. Yeah. Yes, there are all these things, but like, and I feel like crap, or I feel guilty, or I feel this, like, but what do I do with all this, right? And no one was giving me that information. The other piece that, my brain's a little bit wired in the ADHD neurodivergent spectrum. And so one of the things, so if I ever get on a spaghetti rant and you're like,
oh, welcome to my world.
Okay, great.
I am
so bring me back if that happens. Like, no worries. I'm not, prideful about that. But one of the things, so with that, I see patterns, right? And one of the patterns that I started noticing over the last decade of being in this grief work was that a lot of people were talking about grief just in those kind of 5 stages manner.
Right.
And no one was acknowledging the piece of trauma in grief. And when your body experiences trauma, which is a lot of us going through significant loss, when your body experiences trauma, your brain actually changes the way that it shows up and operates and functions. And so when you're, a lot of times in grief, you'll hear people say, oh, you just need to go talk to someone, go to a grief counselor, go to a grief therapist, go to a grief support group. Well, if you had a traumatic loss, your body is not going to want to talk first. Like, your body needs physical support first. Right. Like, you have to feel safe before you can open up in conversation. And so there's like somatic work that we can do to support our bodies and support our nervous systems to feel safe so that we can actually access the part of our brain.
Like what could you do to make yourself feel safe?
It depends on the situation, right? Okay. So one of the things I ask people is to ask themselves, when do I feel safe? Where do I feel safe? Who do I feel safe with? Who, where are all these things? So, for example, with Skylar, we had a lot of equipment in her nursery. So we had, a pulse ox machine, a feeding pump, a cough assist, a shaking vest, a suction machine, like all these things, right? So there are like beeps going on all the time. So for a while, it was like anytime I heard beeping, I would like go into a panic because it would be like, oh, her alarms are going off, like something's wrong, right? So like safety for me was peace and quiet.
Yeah.
So like it was stillness.
Beeping was a trigger for you. It became a trigger. Yeah.
So, and we talk about triggers. Yep. Yeah. And so anytime your nervous system is activated into that survival mode of fight or flight, freeze, fawn, whatever it is, that's where you pay attention and notice that. And a lot of deep breathing. So like the cool thing about our brains and our bodies, we're designed to heal. And so in our brains, when that survival mode kicks in, it's a little piece of your brain called the amygdala that takes over. And when that happens, you are basically into animal mode, like thinking about like tigers in Africa, right? Or Asia, where you're like, okay, like I am having to outrun this tiger. When you get out of the survival mode, you can come back into your prefrontal cortex, which is right behind your forehead. And that area is responsible for all of the elevated thinking that makes us human versus animal, right? So that's where we have creative problem solving, innovation, empathy, emotional connection, rational thinking, all of that. And so that's where it's like, it's so challenging for me to see all these grief resources not address the trauma, because it's like, if someone's stuck in their amygdala and they're worried about getting chased by a tiger and just surviving that, you can't have a rational conversation with someone, right?
You go offline.
You can't access your emotions because you can't think. It's do, right? Do is survival.
Right.
And so that's been the biggest thing about my book, is really trying to help people navigate the trauma intertwined with the grief, and helping them support their body, support their nervous systems, and really understand how the body works and how we're all connected, right? So posture matters, fascia, lymph, there's so much of these little systems in our body and significant systems in our body that we don't even think about and we're not taught about.
So when you say lymph, like something like even getting like a lymphatic massage to release.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes. And the flow, right? So like movement is life. What the difference between a live person and a dead person is movement, right? Your heart is pumping, your blood is flowing, you're breathing. There's this movement and flow and circulation. And so like there's warmth, it's like there's so much energy too that's like flowing through the body. And so part of it is helping people understand, all of that's connected in our bodily systems. And so how can we support ourselves to healing is really about supporting every system in our body to become whole again. So a lot of times in grief, we like disconnect, or we have these like internal fractures or blockages. And it's a protective mechanism, right? And so that's something that in the book we kind of talk through.
Protective mechanism, you mean because you want to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, or it doesn't feel safe, so I gotta not feel that, right? Or that this is causing me pain, and so my brain is wired to avoid pain, so I'm just not gonna go there.
How did you, because obviously just from me talking to you the first 45 minutes when I met you, and anyone listening to you now, and again, I don't want to like beat a dead horse and keep bringing up the fact with losing Skylar after 21 months, but you definitely did, a lot of research, to learn all this.
Of course,
you're very informed. Do you present it in your book in a way that someone who's not as literate, if you will, would be able to take those tools and use them? Because like I said, every single one of us has something going on in our life that, what their parents getting divorced, them getting divorced, having cancer, whatever it is.
Even like moving communities, right?
Right.
Like moves are a big grief that people don't acknowledge. But yes, the book is meant for, the book has things in it that will help anyone who's experienced grief. I wrote it specifically for people who have just experienced a significant loss, because I feel like that is a very vacant area in the grief support world, but it will help anyone and everyone who's been through a loss, no matter the time scale. There should be something in the book that will speak to you regardless of the timetable, right?
I like how includes, again, a lot, because Sharon knows we've talked about, I have a close friend who recently lost a job, and they were not expecting it. It was out of the blue. They were just, let go. And it's been extremely traumatic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm no expert on getting fired or the trauma from losing a job, but it would make sense to me that for this person to be able to move on, get a new job, move on in life, they're going to need
They're stuck. They're feeling stuck.
They're feeling stuck. They're going to need to deal with that trauma of being fired.
The one thing I'll say too is I wrote it for, I tried to write it as elementary as I possibly could, so that even middle schoolers reading it or high schoolers reading it. So my first significant loss was, I lost some grandparent type figures and my grandpa in middle school. But really the first shocker loss that really was very traumatic for me was in high school, when two friends died in a car accident at different times. And so it was the first time where as a kid, you're like, oh, we're not immortal, right? You're like, oh, okay, this is real. And then the school was like, okay, the guidance counselor's here if you need him. And you're like, yeah, no one's gonna be caught dead going to the guidance counselor's office,
Yeah.
And so But so I wrote my book so that even high schoolers, potentially even middle schoolers, I haven't tested that, on the material as far as age level, but I wrote it so that as young of people as possible could read it.
The trauma these young kids are going
through. Oh my gosh.
With all of the shootings in
elementary
schools.
And I mean, I tried,
hope they're getting the help they need.
And they're not.
Because I had mentioned earlier, before earlier today when you got here, how there was a athlete at University of Virginia back in like 2010-11 who was killed by her lacrosse player boyfriend. Oh. And there were a couple of players on her team who said that they just, they had no one to talk to. They had no way to process it. It was so unexpected to have a teammate who's murdered. Yeah. That it was really difficult. No way to, discuss their feelings or process it or deal with the trauma.
And schools aren't equipped to deal with that, and they're not funded to deal with that. And yet we're all human, right? And we all go through life experiences. Some are very traumatic. And so, part of me creating the nonprofit that I did and writing the book was to fill in some of those gaps, right? To see the needs in society and say, hey, no one's showing up for these people, or no one's doing this thing that can be really helpful. I think I can do it. And it's going to take some sacrifice. And I'm not a trust fund kid. So I'm, it's bootstrapping from the ground up, but I think I can do it. And I'm pretty confident that there are people out there who understand the need of this and will help me do it and give it to the people in need.
So before we move on from the book, when will it be available, and where can people purchase the book?
So the book will be available, I'm hoping in, May. Okay. May or June.
Yep.
It's being published through Ripples Media, and it will be available on Amazon.
Okay.
Barnes & Noble. It should be, in most online retailers, and then certainly Amazon. And then we're working on an audiobook later this year.
Okay, great. So I want to move on to the foundation that you founded, because I think that's important that we share as well. But before we close, the title of the book, again, sorry, I'm stumbling, is When You Can't See the Light, a trauma-informed guide to surviving a significant loss. And it sounds like it's going to be filled with a lot of great helpful information to support people that are going through that. So your foundation is called the Momento Foundation. That's the nonprofit that you founded. Tell us about that. How did that come about?
So when Skylar, it's like a whole full story, spaghetti bowl here. Yeah. So when Skylar died, you were asking kind of how did you deal, right? And a lot of books, again, told me what to do, or what I would think or what I might feel, but no one told me what to do.
Right.
And one of the things, being a photographer, a friend of mine had gifted us a professional portrait session. And so we had the photos with Skylar that were absolutely beautiful, just stunning. It was one of the best gifts ever. And
much better with Skylar than with an Addison or Tallulah, right? Yes, Skylar. I think the book with Skylar is much better.
And so, it was really interesting because every morning I would go in, I was her primary mom. I mean, I am her mom, but primary caregiver. So I was full-time mom, primary caregiver, and every morning I would start her routines. We had a breathing treatment, stuff like that. But I would always go in and wake her up and say, good morning, sweet girl, blah, blah, blah. So when she died and we cleared out all of her equipment, her room was just so empty and the whole house felt lifeless. Kyle had to go back to work. And I was just left thinking, who am I now, right? Because I'm not a mom, but I am a mom, but I'm not a mom, right? And then what am I doing? Because now I'm just sitting around this house with nothing to do, and the silence is deafening. It was just torture. So what I learned, and kind of intuitively, I just kind of naturally did this, but the first couple days she was gone, I couldn't stand to look at any of the photos because it was so painful to see her and know that she's not here, right? So it was it just felt so unfair. And so I just turned all the photos down, and it was just, my heart couldn't take looking at her knowing she was gone. But after about like 2 weeks, I just missed her so much, right? So one by one, I started turning them back up around the house. And then, I'd put one on our shelf in our nursery, and I'd go in there and say, "Good morning, sweet girl."
Did you do what you see a lot in movies that people do, or you read when you're reading a book, fiction, what have you, when they're telling a story? Did you go and smell her outfits that she would
sometimes
wear,
yeah. And we used at the time we were using like the Burt's Bees products, so like and that became a trigger too, because like when other moms would use that on their kids and I would go hold their kids, I'd be like, ugh, right? Like, yeah,
powerful,
right? And it would just crush me. But it was good too. It was nostalgic, of course, but yeah, I really spent most of my time with the photographs. And what I learned was these photographs allowed me to sit and cry, and like really ugly cry, like sobbing, moaning, snot pouring out of my face, and just being whatever I needed to be in that moment. And then they also gave me a way to continue that bond with her and that relationship, to just tell her how much I miss her and, just talk to her. And so really like that first full year of raw, hard grief, the photos were the most helpful tool that I had in just letting me process and be with my grief. And what I learned too is that feeling was actually healing. And so I learned that to heal, we have to grieve. To grieve, we have to feel. And to feel, you have to be present. And our society rewards people for checking out, right?
It's a lot, let's be honest, it's a lot easier to check out.
Totally.
Than to feel.
Right, and to be present.
Yeah.
And so those
But I love that
photographs
line
were the
just said,
tool.
feeling is healing.
Yes.
That's really powerful.
Yeah. And so
feeling.
when we hold it in, that's when our body like cramps up or gets disease or develops illness. It's like we're not meant to hold this all in that we're feeling in the world.
No, but it's really scary to be present and feel.
Oh, for sure. Right. It is not fun when you have pain. Right. And so, but that's what I learned. It was like, wow, this is really, really powerful. And I'm a photographer. I can give this gift to other people. So I started, anytime I heard of anyone facing a terminal diagnosis, I would say, please let me photograph your family. And I'm thinking back, I'm like, yeah, everyone took me up on it.
I was just going to ask you that question.
Yeah, everyone took me up on
You
it.
up on it.
And it was so powerful. Now, the first couple sessions, I like bawled my eyes out. Editing, even, photographing too, but it was so powerful because there were so many beautiful stories of impact that came out of it that affirmed my hypothesis that photographs really are an incredible support tool in grief. Now, at this point, I didn't even know there was research that backed that up. It was just my own personal hypothesis.
Even if some people say, like, I lost my mom at 21, and I always look at it, I like to look at my glasses half full and think I was lucky. I feel like I lost my mom, not my mommy. I'd graduated college. I dated boys while she was there. But I personally did struggle a little with trying to keep in my mind her when she wasn't sick with cancer and thin. And so I wonder if anyone struggles with that in terms of the photo, if they have someone that's sick, seeing them in the photo.
So,
sick.
Yes, and it can still be helpful because the photographer that did the session with our family, with Skylar, she came when Skylar was around 6 to 7 months old, which is really when she was at her best.
Right. Yeah.
Like she wasn't technology dependent. She was full of personality, just amazing. That same photographer came back when Skylar was about 16 months old. And at 19 months old, we knew it was like really close to the end, right? So she wasn't feeling good that day. It wasn't a great session, but we still captured her at her 16-month-old state, right? Yeah. So like we could tell like, wow, she's so long and lean and, her hair's grown and whatever. But she wasn't feeling good and you could tell she was hurting. And it was hard to look back at those photos because I was like, oh man, and this was close to the end. And yet so often we question, especially if we had to make the decision, right? So like I had to choose to unplug her machine and take her essentially off life support, right? And so that was one of the hardest things that I've ever had to do. And literally, like, I was the one who turned off her machine. And so for the first bunch of months, I hated myself because I was like, was that what I was supposed to do? Could we have gotten more time with her? Yeah. You know, like, this is so hard. And yet when I look back at those photos, they're confirmation that she was hurting. They're confirmation that she was suffering.
Okay. And
it was really helpful to see I wasn't making it up. She was actually not good, right? Like, there were lots of things, and our whole medical team was supportive and saying, like, this is the end. Like, there's no more, you know, we can't do anything, blah, blah, blah. But you still always question, and you have that potential guilt hanging over your head, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, that was like one way that harder photos helped, right? Because they confirmed, like, man, they were in pain, and it's better that they're not here because that's how bad they were hurting.
And then with that, have you and Kyle ever, you know, looked back and asked yourself that question, you know, if you knew then what you knew now, you know, would you have had the pregnancy or?
You know, it's interesting because Skylar was such a gift in so many ways. Not just like, yes, she was a beautiful baby girl, right? And gave me this amazing experience of becoming a mom and breastfeeding and having like somewhat of a normal motherhood for the first 2 months, you know? But also it was my awakening, you know? And I wouldn't go back and change it for anything. I mean, Kyle and I have struggled financially since then because, you know, insurance didn't cover a whole lot, and funeral expenses are insane. And we chose a natural burial for her, which was beautiful. Kyle made her box himself.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot that we did very intentionally. But it went, I mean, it was a lot. And then obviously afterwards we were grieving and really struggling. And so I look back and I'm like, man, understanding, you know, compounding interest, right? Like, we missed out so much financially in our 20s because we were having a baby and then burying a baby and having medical bills that were astronomical.
Right, not living the life.
I don't want to interrupt, but I have a question that's coming to me. Do you mind if I
ask?
Yeah,
please.
So you brought up Kyle, and I'm just wondering, do you find, and maybe you can't speak to this, maybe it's more of a question for him, but do you find that men grieve differently than women? Like,
That's a great question, Sharon.
I mean, how did he grieve the loss of? How is it different than how you did?
So it's interesting because grief is unique to every individual.
Right.
I do think there are differences in genders.
Okay.
So men growing up are not given permission to cry, right? You're told, don't cry, toughen up, you know, like, be a man, don't, you know, crying's for sissies or whatever, right?
Yeah, my son wasn't.
And they're also the protector.
Yes.
And he couldn't protect her.
And the provider and the strong man, right. You know.
Yeah.
So there are definitely gender roles, depending on how you adopt that in your own family, that can influence how you grieve. The other piece Kyle and I were very different. So I'm much more like Lauren, where I'll just go up and talk to anybody. And I'm a verbal processor. I have no shortage of words. And Kyle's always like, dude, like, let me go off in nature. I'm going to disappear for a day and then I'll come back and talk to you. Right. So he's a very internal processor, a deep thinker. And he's an introvert and I'm an extrovert. And so that was really hard and sometimes I would hear him like crying in the bathroom and I'd be like, well, does he want me to go in and support him? Does he not want me to go in and support him? Like,
that's hard.
You know, like, does he want a hug? Does he not want a hug? And, So that was a really hard
And
challenge.
he needs to have his process too.
Well,
Right.
And a lot of marriages don't survive this type of a loss.
Yeah.
I think it is something
it's
ridiculous.
very rare.
I meant to Google it. Something like 6% of marriages survive losing a child.
I mean,
Yeah. And I don't know how accurate that study was because I've tried to look into that.
Oh, yeah.
But even like, you know, you look at just marriage in general, right? Like 50% end in divorce, right?
Right.
So like, you're like, well, the odds are already stacked against you if you get married. And so,
50-50 shot.
50-50 shot. And then you lose a kid and you're like, oh, great. Like that doesn't help, right?
Right.
So, it's not great. But I think, you know, Kyle and I, like, despite the financial hardships that we endured, despite everything, and I kind of like loop back around to that question of like, you know, I wouldn't trade it for anything because it truly was like this awakening for me of like, I kind of joke that before Skylar was BS, you know, like total bullshit, right? Like I cared about name brands. I cared about how I looked to everyone else. I wanted the Range Rover with the white picket fence. And like, I wanted all the things, right? I cared about so much that didn't matter. And then she died and I buried her and Kyle and I literally dug the hole and buried her ourselves. And we were like, you literally can't take anything with you. Like you get one outfit, maybe some jewelry, we wrapped her in a blanket, you know? Mm-hmm. And it's like, that's it. And what's left is the love that you share.
It is, but it is to go back to everyone dealing with the grief or trauma differently. Mm-hmm. You know, I am now going, this June will hopefully be 4 years since I was diagnosed with uterine cancer. I was very, very, very lucky. They caught it crazy early. I didn't need chemo. I didn't need radiation. It was a little hard for me because some people, like my twin sister, my identical twin sister, saw it as though I didn't really have cancer because I didn't need chemo or radiation. However, for me, I've had to deal with sort of suddenly feeling immortal and then being a little bit irresponsible in terms of, well, I'm going to die anyway. Oh, I want that. I should buy it. Or, you know, this is just me living my truth. I've had conversations with my husband that, you know, I can't use that as an excuse or a crutch but certainly we all deal with a situation like that differently. And for me, it's still 4 years later has made me feel so, you know, mortal.
Yes.
And thinking, oh, fuck it. I'm just going to do it.
Yeah.
You know,
well, and it is there's an awakening there that's like, because our society is completely grief illiterate. Right? We don't talk about death.
I was grief illiterate.
Yeah.
Didn't talk about my mom.
We don't talk about death. We don't talk about sex. We don't talk about...
So literally,
right? And Sharon
and
and
money,
I are trying,
right?
We're trying to change that.
I mean, That's
why I was so excited to have you
on. It makes people so uncomfortable.
It does.
So uncomfortable.
And what's worse, so death, sex, and money, right?
Yeah, right.
So Kyle's like, you literally started a nonprofit where you have to ask people money for people dying. Like the only thing worse is if you somehow manage to throw sex in there. He was like, you literally picked the hardest path forward. Like, why? And I was like, because no one else is doing it. Right. Yeah. And like, apparently I'm a glutton for punishment. And I can handle some suffering because, you know, it's starting a nonprofit.
But let me tell you, like, I mean, I am so inspired by the fact that you turned your pain into purpose. And that's a huge deal, and you should be really proud of yourself for doing that, for taking that risk and the leap of faith that requires, because you're right. It is not an easy path.
It does. And also you are just a remarkable example that you cannot dissect someone in small little bits and pieces that you see them. I mean, I met you, I talked to you for 45 minutes, and until you dropped that bomb, I just looked at you as, oh, here's this beautiful, you know, young woman who I'm talking to who's vivacious and athletic. And the last thing from my mind would have ever been to think you had any type of trauma in your life, just from how easily we conversed and how eager you were to engage in a conversation with me. It just, for me, I take away from that just such a lesson, and that you truly, I say it time and time again, you just don't know what somebody is going through that day, that week, that month, that year, 10 years ago. You just don't know.
So I'm sorry. I was just going to say, if people want to help you with your foundation, how can they help? How can they support you in your mission?
That's amazing. Thank you. Yeah. So Momento Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit. So we do accept donations. They can give online, momentofoundation.org. People give through DAF, donor advised funds, stock, stuff like that. Accepting all of it. And the biggest thing right now is scaling. So obviously funding, we're looking for funding partners. But if you know of photographers, that's an area that we're really looking to grow this year. Photographers across the country. We have a 2-day intensive grief and trauma training for photographers who want to volunteer with us. Completely covered. It's free. So anyone you know who's a photographer, just send them to our website, and there's a link for photographers to apply to volunteer with us.
Okay.
And then, just spreading the word. Like, the book is going to be huge. Really excited about that. And, we have an online community that anyone's welcome to join. We have a book club that meets every quarter, talking about, challenging topics and stuff like that. So, And
your website.
Sharon, do you know what's crazy?
What's that?
I donated to this charity before I even knew who Ashley was.
I know.
And when I discovered what her charity was, I said, oh my God, I have a thank you note that I think you signed that had like an X and an O on it, or how random is that, Ashley?
It's awesome.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It's really cool.
We're very fortunate to know Ashley's father and her stepmother.
Yep.
Who were good friends of ours. And so, that's the connection.
How long has your stepmother been your stepmother?
They got married when I was in college.
Okay.
I think I met her when I was 16.
And who does she remind you of?
She reminds me of Anna Winter.
Oh,
but in the positive side, not the devil wears Prada, bitch asshole side. But she's just so put together. And look chic. She's just one of those women that you can't.
She's a boss lady. Yeah, she's awesome.
Heritage.
Yeah.
She needs to come on our podcast. Because
she's a total
badass.
Yeah,
I think last time I talked to her, she had just flown from or was flying to some big event somewhere where there was going to be like crystal and champagne.
Oh, she's kind of a big deal in Atlanta.
Yeah, she's a big deal.
She's kind of a big deal.
She's amazing. Yeah, it's been really cool to have. I mean, obviously the divorce sucked, and I was an only child, so I got stuck in the middle of a really nasty, fallout. But all that to say, it's been such a gift to have her join in my life, because she is a badass boss lady and has been such an inspiration with business, because I don't have that in my other moms. My in-law is a great mom too.
Of her own either, does she? So
no.
You're a bonus child.
Yes. And my in-laws are great as well. And each mom brings a different gift and strength to guide, to be that guide and mentor figure in my life. So I feel very fortunate, despite the pain that, I went through to get there. But it's been awesome.
Yeah, it's not easy. Well, we have to wrap it up today, unfortunately, but we've really loved having you here. And thank you for being so vulnerable and for sharing your story so honestly and openly. I think it will help a lot of our listeners to help them
I think it'll help a lot of people. And we do, Sharon and I do like to ask people who come on, what advice you would give your younger self, knowing what you know now.
I would absolutely focus more on my own health and wellness and prioritizing myself, because I was taught to sacrifice myself for other people. And, I think one of the things, knowing what I know about the nervous system and health and wellness, like looking at what areas in my life are causing me stress and how can I lessen those, because stress causes so much inflammation and disease that people don't even recognize. I would change my diet way, like when Kyle met me, he was like, I don't know how you're not 300 pounds. Like you are disgusting. Yeah.
Wait, really quick, give us something like really disgusting you would eat.
I would sit with a fork and eat a whole Mrs. Smith's Oreo pie by myself.
Stop.
In college. Yeah.
Stop.
Well, I was playing lacrosse and rowing, so I could just pound 5,000 calories.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. So anyway, it was like Twinkies and white powdered sugar donuts.
God, Twinkies are
yes.
So,
chemical.
okay, wait, but when I love Twinkies, that was my go-to. I'm just going to say when I was younger, but I would always cut it in half and lick the filling out of the middle. That's how it is.
Sharon, that sounds kind of naughty. Just saying. Sounds a little naughty.
Cream horns. I was all about the vanilla.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, I would absolutely, change my diet, prioritize myself, and then also really understand the power of mindfulness and presence. And that's something, looking back, I'm like, gosh, like I know, there's so much in my life that would be better had I been able to train myself in, mindfulness, just knowing how to process emotions, knowing how to better communicate with people, right? Like there's so many times that I communicated so poorly because I didn't know how to process what I was feeling. Yeah. And so it was just an outburst instead of a thoughtful conversation,
I
right?
feel like the universe is shifting in that direction too.
Yeah.
Be more mindful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
we're all trying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
And I think too, your point earlier, right? Like you never know what people are going through. Like I used to just like have a little bit more of like a harsh judgment as my gut reaction. And now it's like very much like always assume the best in people.
Right.
And understand that like anyone who's ugly, not like physically ugly, but like, like really like person. An ugly person. Yes. Like anyone who's ugly or angry or,
Might be going through.
Yeah. It's like the addiction, right? Violence, suicidal thoughts, depression, like all of these things that are just like plaguing our society. It's like usually the root is unresolved grief and trauma. So it's someone's hurting, which is why they're hurting other people. And so that's something that like going back, I wish I knew because I took so much of that personally. When someone was mean to me,
right.
I took it personally. And it's like, oh, I know it's not me. It's about them. They can't process
hurt people.
Yeah. Exactly.
And this is why Ashley Jones refers to herself as the ambassador of love.
Yes.
I love that. And I love you, Ashley.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for coming on, Ashley.
Yeah. Thank you.
Peace out, ladies.
Peace out, Girl Scout.